Allah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. I welcome you all to a discovery journey how Islamic civilization and sciences impacted the West. This is going to be a series of talks. Altogether, there will be 12 parts. Approximately, I think I will get opportunity to present every 5 to 6 weeks, one part. So the first part that we're going to do today, it will focus on the Western or European attitude towards Islamic civilization and sciences, past and present. But consequent, parts I just gave you here outline approximately what they are going to cover. We'll talk about European Dark Age and the rise of Islamic civilization and sciences. We'll talk about Muslims' perspective on knowledge, empirical sciences, philosophy, and the translation movement of the 8th and 9th century that translated ancient knowledge into Arabic. Then we'll talk about ideas from the Muslim Golden Age that shaped the foundation of modern sciences and modern life that still impact our lives today. We'll cover different areas from mathematics to astronomy, medicine, architecture, even luxury lifestyles. And we'll cover probably about 5 to 6 parts in this area. There is so much to talk about. And then we'll discuss about European translation of Muslim knowledge to Latin language and the start of European universities and early European thinkers who drank from the springs of Muslim intellectuals. Probably we'll have 2 parts in that area, and we will close it or finalize it with the decline of Islamic civilization and sciences and the rise of European Renaissance. You can all hear me, right? But my voice is strong enough? You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Now, why this series important? First of all, we all know that there's a lot of misunderstanding today in the West about Islam, but you'll be surprised to see that there's even more misunderstanding about the debt the West owed to Islam and Muslims. Europeans, they tend to see Islam as an alien religion and a rival to their culture. In the Middle Age, it was a rival to Christianity. That's what the way they saw. And today, they see it as a rival to secularism. They also tend to deny and erase Muslims' great contribution and relevance to their own rise, to their own renaissance, and to their intellectual and cultural history. In the Middle Age, it was Islam actually that preserved the ancient knowledge, not only the Greek knowledge, but also from Chinese, from Persian, from Indian knowledge that was vanishing very fast at that time. And it was Islam that gave tremendous boost to stimulate the studies of the natural sciences, what we understand as science today. So sciences and innovations became the hallmark of the Islamic civilization. Contrary to the views that is propagated today that Islam is incompatible with sciences and reason, or Islam needs reformation and enlightenment, what we heard, recently, resonated in France and in other parts of the West. So the study of the impact of Islamic civilization and sciences on the West requires sifting through a vast amount of reading material. Usually you cannot get everything in one place. You have to go through a lot of material. And I have given you here some, some possibilities. There are a lot of other sources for some of you who might be interested, in going a little bit deeper. Some of the sources, they are very specialized. For example, this book by George Saliba, Islamic Science and the Making of the European Renaissance, it's focusing really on astronomy. As opposed, there is another book that came out this year, Stealing from the Saracens. This one is focusing more on architecture. 1001 Invention is quite nice, easy reading, because it's kind of giving you very general contribution. And the 1001 Cures, it focuses on medicine and healthcare. So there's a lot to read from different sources. Now, since the content of this series is historical, it will be a good idea, first of all, to understand in the Western context, the historical timeline. So when we talk about modern age, what we are in now, from the Western perspective, it really started in Europe in the year after 1500. So it started from the 16th century to the present. This is the age that they call it the modern age. And it was marked by the Spanish reconquista of Andalusia when the Christians took the Andalus, so the Muslim Spain, the last bit, because the reconquista, it took almost 500 years. But the last bit, it was taken the fall of Granada in 1492. And also it coincided, just a coincidence, the same year, 1492, the Columbus discovery of the New World and Vasco da Gama's discovery of sea trade to India. So things went very well for Europeans, beginning of, of this period. Then modern age was preceded by a period of 1,000 years that is called the Middle Age. Sometimes they use plural, Middle Ages, but it doesn't matter. Now, the Middle Age set in around the 500 Common Era, and this marked the fall of Rome in 476 to barbarians. And at this time, Europe lost its urban life, intellectual and cultural activities. This is the period sometimes is referred as the Dark Age. And the Dark Age is not a term that was invented by Muslims. This is the term that was invented by Europeans themselves. They consider this is the period where they didn't have any intellectual and cultural activities. Sometimes this period is also referred as a Middle Age, all right, or Middle Ages. Now, the Middle Age was in turn preceded by another 1,000 years of classical period. This is the time of Greco-Roman civilization, which set in about 500 BCE, or before the Common Era, or before the birth of Prophet Isa alayhi salam. It started with the Greeks, and then the Greek, fell, and then the Romans took over, and until when Rome fell in 476. Okay, so this is the reference, because it's important when we talk about modern age, we talk about Middle Age, we need to understand, and when we talk about ancient or classical Greek time or Greco-Roman, we need to understand that. Now, Europeans, they consider modernity and science in general, science and innovation, is really a sort of an European enterprise. It started with the classical period, and then in the Middle Age, they went to sleep. And then in the modern age, starting from 16th century, they kind of rediscover. And they call this rebirth or renaissance. So the word renaissance actually coming, from regaining what they lost in the classical period. Now, I would like to start with a quotation from a French social anthropologist who lived in the last century. And I think this quote will set a tone for our lecture today and also for the series. So he said in his book, The Making of Humanity, it was under the influence of the Arabian and Moorish revival of culture that the real Renaissance took place. It was Spain, not Italy, was the cradle of the rebirth of Europe. A very strong statement. After steadily sinking lower and lower into barbarism, it had reached the darkest depths of ignorance and degradation when the cities of Saracenic world, Baghdad, Cairo, Cordova, Toledo, were growing centers of civilization and intellectual activity. He used the word Saracenic world. This is a term that was used in the Middle Age to describe Arabs and Muslims. And, there's a many explanation, the etymology of this word, Saracenic, but there's a lady who gave recently an explanation, and he said Saracenic actually, it comes from the Arabic word sarika, because the European, they viewed Arabs and Muslims as thieves. All right, so the word Saracens came about. The debt of Europe to Islam and Muslim could find no place in the scheme of European and Christian history. These are not words of a Muslim. These are words of a French social anthropologist. And not even in this century, this is in the previous century. The history of the rebirth of Europe from barbarism is constantly being written without any reference to the influence of Arab civilization, except to mention the triumphs of the cross over the crescent and the reconquista of Spain from the Moorish yoke. Okay, so this is the general sort of attitude. There is sort of denial, and in some ways is also sort of erasing whatever that the Muslims contributed to civilization. Now, I want to, I've designed this talk into, I'll be talking about 4 events or scenarios, okay? One took place in 1510, and this is a painting, a Raphael painting in the Vatican. It's called the School of Athens, because this painting actually really summarizes the sort of Western attitudes towards Islamic civilization. And I will talk about Pope Benedict's lecture at Regensburg in 2006, which created uproar in Muslim world. And then I'll talk about the Notre Dame Cathedral fire, which took place last year. And if we get time, I'll try to discuss a little bit about the last month's President Emmanuel Macron's speech, because he touches also some issues related to Islam and Islamic civilization. So this is a painting, very famous. It's called the School of Athens. It's a fresco that is on the wall of Pope's residence in the Vatican. And it was commissioned in 1511 by a famous Italian he was architect and artist at the same time, Raphael. And the School of Athens is actually reflecting a real School of Athens that was 1,000 years earlier in Alexandria during the heydays of the Greco-Roman civilization. Because Alexandria, it was an intellectual center of Greco-Roman civilization. Now, the painting is supposed to show who is who of Renaissance thinkers. This was a time, it's a, just beginning of 16th century when Europe was just re-emerging from the, darkness. What is interesting in this painting, and this is the reason why I included this, you have these thinkers, European thinkers of the Renaissance time, who are masquerading faces of their classical Greek counterparts. So, for example, you have there a picture of Leonardo da Vinci takes the face of Plato, and Bramante takes the face of Euclid. What it does, this this painting, it symbolizes there was a direct handover of Greek knowledge from ancient Greece to modern Europe. That's what it symbolizes. And this is, really summarizes the attitude of Europeans. They're thinking of their Renaissance has got nothing to do with Islam and Muslims. It's, they got it directly from the classical Greece. And therefore, it undercuts the role of Islamic civilization and sciences in the making of the European rebirth. And this is what allows, the West to claim that modern sciences are purely of European origin, which is not true. And this is what we need to discover. But Raphael was kind enough to include in this painting an image of Ibn Rushd, but he didn't give him any important role as such. That he didn't present it like the Europeans. They got their knowledge from the Muslims. He presented him that he's cheating on Pythagoras. He's looking good. He's learning. He's just leaning over the shoulder of Pythagoras.
When the place is called Aquarium, something like that. So we'll come back on lunchtime.
Sheikh Hafidh, can you help me to mute the... So I want to present an alternative to this Eurocentric view of intellectual history. When Islam arrived in the 7th century, Europeans had already descended into the so-called Dark Age for nearly 2 centuries, because Islam arrived in the 7th century and Rome fell in the 5th century. So they had lost their urban life and connection to classical Greek philosophy and learning. Now, motivated by the spirit of discovery and rational inquiry that is reflected from the Quranic and prophetic teachings, Muslims, they started to gather knowledge of the world, translated it into Arabic, studied it, synthesized it, and build new ideas on it, and shared freely with the rest of humanity. They found also a great institution of learning and research that became later the models for the West. Because this was all original ideas, because there were no any example to copy at that time. There was no any, blueprints of kind of institutions like universities and, to copy. So really Muslims have found this from scratch, from zero. They also produced many new scientific ideas and innovation that formed the foundation of the modern sciences and the modern world. Europeans, they managed to pull themselves out of the dark age in the 16th and 17th centuries only after they discover Muslims' knowledge of sciences and philosophy. Therefore, Islamic civilization and sciences really formed the basis of the European rebirth or Renaissance. Okay, so this, this one scenario really has indicated to you, sort of the general attitude of Europeans. Either they deny or, starting from the last few decades, there has been some acknowledgement, but even that has been marginalized. It has not been, given in a full extent. And even Muslims, for Muslims as well, we do not have enough understanding, and therefore we need to study more about this. I don't deny there are some, there are some fair-minded Europeans who have written about it in the past as well as present. There's somebody who raised hand. Is there a question or something? Maybe we can keep the last 5 minutes for questions, 5-10 minutes. Okay, so in 2006, Pope Benedict, he gave a lecture in the University of Regensburg in Bavaria. And through this lecture, he caused a huge controversy because of his remark. And his remark, it kind of restated the old European hostility and accusation against Prophet Muhammad SAW, that he spread Islam by the power of sword, not power of persuasion. This is the actual statement. So in his lecture, Pope Benedict, he quoted the 15th century Byzantine Emperor Manuel II, very offensive quotation. Emperor Manuel II, he said, back in the 15th century, he said, show me just what Muhammad brought that was new, and there you will find things only evil and inhuman, such as his command to spread by the sword the faith he preached. So this is a statement, and it was very misfortune that Pope Benedict, in the 21st century, he will echo this statement. Now, the West could not understand why the Muslims across the world express outrage at this remark. And the reason, because the European discourse, any discourse about Islam, any discussion about Islam, is always symbolized by hostility and distorted narratives about Prophet Muhammad's life and teachings. We see this even today. I mean, right now, what is going on in France is just a typical example. All right. It happened in the Middle Ages, but it happened in this modern time as well. It tends to be also a direct discourse about the self. It's more about, usually it's about the European culture. And really, they like to present this dichotomy of European being enlightened against Islam being barbaric. Most of the time, it boils down into this dichotomy. Now, I would like to analyze a little bit this, this quotation. Now, Pope Benedict's lecture was entitled actually Faith and Reason. And he did not need at all to mention anything about Islam or Prophet Muhammad. He could have delivered his lecture without that reference. But he wanted to claim compatibility between biblical teachings and the Greek rationalism. But because he wanted to stress that this compatibility is unique to Europeans or to Christians, he did that at the expense of Islam. And this is where, you know, this discourse always, it comes this way. Because they usually want to, you know, define or redefine their identity, but always at the cost of Islam. Now, what is interesting is Pope Benedict, he ignored that the church itself had closed all Greek philosophy schools in the Western domains 100 years before the arrival of Islam in the 7th century. And the reason, because they contradicted biblical teachings. For example, we're talking about the destruction of the Western side. It was actually that it came from the barbarians, but even the Eastern domain, you know, of the Byzantine Empire. In Syria, for example, the famous school Edessa, which taught classical medicine and philosophy, it was closed in 489 by Byzantine Emperor Zeno. And the school of Athens, you know, the school that is in the painting of Raphael, which was in Alexandria, it was closed in 529 by Byzantine Emperor Justinian I. And the teachers who used to teach in those schools, they fled and settled in Persia, and they set the schools in Persia, what is today Iran. In fact, if you read history, you will find that, and this is the West themselves, you know, they write about this. They say the closing of the school of Athens in Alexandria by Emperor Justinian I in 529 was considered as the last light to be put out in Europe as the Dark Age closed in, making the death in the West not only of classical Greek philosophy and learning, but of reason as well, until when Muslims arrived at the scene. Okay, so to accuse Muslims, you know, of not being, you know, subscribing to reason and to use of violence to spread Islam, it's really quite offensive. There is a lot of painting, if you Google, you can find related to this lady, Hypatia. She was a mathematician and a philosopher. Even her father, I think, was a very known figure in intellectual figure. And this lady, she taught mathematics and the Neoplatonic philosophy in Alexandria, which was the intellectual heart of the declining Roman Empire at that time. She was brutally murdered by a Christian mob in 415, simply because of her teachings were contradictory to biblical doctrines. So for someone to come today and to say, you know, Islam is not compatible to reason, but on the contrary, Christianity is, you know, has always been gelling well with the Greek philosophy of the Greek rationalism. It is not presenting truth at all. Now, following of, you know, the conquest of Byzantium and Sassanid territories, the Persian territories, it was Muslim scholars who revived Greek philosophy, logic, and other sciences as well in the 8th century. I will elaborate about this word philosophy, because the philosophy was used in the Middle Ages not to define only philosophy in the sense that we understand today. It really covers almost all sciences, like natural philosophy. Now, it will take another 400 years. So Muslims, they restarted this, the intellectual activities, they revived the Greek knowledge in the 8th century, starting with these translation movements, especially in Baghdad, started in Baghdad, but then it devolved in many other Muslim cities. But it will take another 400 years until the 12th century before Europeans had access to Latin translations of philosophy and logic work of great Muslim scholars such as Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, Al-Ghazali, Ibn Tufail, Ibn Bajjah, and Ibn Rushd, and others as well. Muslims are the ones who actually introduce rationalism, in terms of philosophy and logic to the modern Europe. For example, the two great Christian theologians, St. Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas, they acknowledge their indebtedness to Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina in the development of their own Christian theology. Okay, so this is very contradictory to what Pope Benedict was talking about. So what Pope Benedict referred in his lecture as the encounter between the biblical message and the Greek thought was in fact an encounter between the Christian dogma and the Islamic rationality, thus directly refuting his central claim that Islam has been devoid of rationality or hostile to rationality, or even the suggestion that Islam was propagated by sword. Okay, so we're discussing about particular events, but in the process, we're also picking those contributions, all right? How Islamic civilization and Islamic science impacted the West. Now, since I talk about the Greek knowledge, it will be interesting to elaborate a few things. Now, I will also first quote Robert Briford again. And he said, the ancient world was, as we saw, pre-scientific. So even though there was Greek philosophy, there was Greek learning, there was a little bit written about medicine, about other things, but it was pre-scientific in the sense of what we know about science. Okay, the astronomy and mathematics of the Greeks were a foreign importation because it came also the Greek. They didn't create this themselves. They borrowed this from Babylonians, which is also has a connection to the Middle East. So when they took it, it remained as a foreign. Why? Because the Greeks, they were able to systematize, generalize, theorize, but patient ways of investigations, the accumulation of positive knowledge, the minute methods of science, empirical science, detailed, prolonged observation, experimental inquiry were altogether alien to the Greek temperament. They didn't have that. And that's why the knowledge that the Muslim they got from the Greek, it was more of natural science, natural philosophy, rather than science as such. So what we call science arose in Europe as a result of a new spirit of inquiry, of new methods of investigation, of the development of mathematics in a form unknown to the Greek. The spirit and those methods were introduced into the European world by the Arabs. Okay, so this is the value addition that came from the Muslims. all right? Because the Muslims, they transform the Greek natural philosophy into science, into scientific methodology, into something what resembles science today. Now, the history of scientific, the history of science, sometimes it portrays not a correct image. Because you hear about Muslims, simply they borrowed and adopted Greek science, which is not true. It is true that the Muslims, they did collect the Greek knowledge, they did translate and hence preserved many of the Greek works, but Muslim science is far more innovative and practical than that of Greek theoretical interpretations. The Greeks were theoreticians and philosophers, and not experimental scientists. It was under the Muslim scholarship that science really gave birth to its modern look or modern child, from natural philosophy to empirical science. So Muslims, they developed from the beginning when they were reading the Greek manuscripts in different areas, whether in astronomy, like Ptolemy, or whether in Ptolemy's work, or in medicine, like Galen's work, or in mathematics. They developed this principle of shukuk, or intellectual skepticism. And to them, shukuk is the beginning of all knowledge. You have to be skeptical in order, really to be able to produce knowledge, which is what gave rise to the need of observations and the practical experiments. These were done in order to challenge the Greek theoretical interpretations. Shukuk was the basis of scientific methodology. Now, the champions of shukuk were people like Ibn al-Haytham, who lived in the 10th and 11th century, Al-Ghazali in the 12th century, and few others. And shukuk had been part of Islamic sciences for 500 years before it was rehashed by French philosopher René Descartes in the 17th century. So now you see the connections, all right? Now, if we try to reflect, okay, on medieval Europe of Emperor Manuel, when he made that statement, Emperor Manuel II, when he made that statement, discrediting Prophet Muhammad SAW, and saying that he didn't do a good job to persuade the people, he just forced them into religion by violence. Now, the Europe of the medieval Europe of Emperor Manuel II, questioning authority was not considered polite at all, especially when it was the authority of the church. The church had at that time monopoly over intellectual matters, and anything that will not conform to Catholic or biblical doctrine was banned. And anyone who defied church ban was in danger, either imprisonment, or you could be excommunicated, what now we call takfir, or even you could be killed. Now, the public banning of heretics, people who are harboring views opposite to those of the church, they became a common sight in medieval Europe. And heretics meant anyone who is foolish enough to question the church. It was the church that decided which books and authors could be read, which doctrines were true and which were false. The Bible could only be read in Latin or Greek, and anyone who even dared to translate it to other common spoken languages could be executed in a public act of terror. Majority of Christian population was ignorant and was denied access to the Bible. Only the clergy who could access the Bible because they're the only one who could actually read Latin and Greek. We have example, William Tyndale. He was the first one to translate the Bible into English language. And he was killed for doing that, act in 1536. In the Middle Age, fear of heretics spreading teachings and opinion that could contradict the Bible, it dominated actually the Catholic Church. They even persecuted scientists who presented theories that the church deemed heretical and forbade people from reading their books. And they placed those books in the index of prohibited books. Now, these two famous Renaissance scholars, we will talk about how these two scholars have been heavily influenced from the work of the Muslim scholars, but that will be a topic of another part, another episode. But here what I want to cite is that Nicholas Copernicus and Galileo Galilei were two scientists who were persecuted by the church and their books were banned. Copernicus was not tried because he died shortly after publishing, but Galileo was tried by Inquisition. And through negotiation, he was kept in house arrest until he died. Now let's look at what the Muslims, in comparison. There was never a crossroad in Islam regarding, use of reason, knowledge, doing sciences. The Quran and Hadith were accessible to everyone right from the beginning. There was no any restriction for people to access to knowledge. Yes, pre-Islamic Arabia, people were illiterate, they could not read, but there was a lot of emphasis when Prophet Muhammad ﷺ started his mission to increase intellectual activities, knowledge, learning, reading, memorizing Quran and Hadith and many other intellectual activities. Islam promoted knowledge. It promoted intellectuality, critical thinking. If you think about how the Quran was collected, very objectively to be preserved, at that time, it's just an amazing. If you look at the science of Isnad, it's just amazing. It shows that in Islam, there was a critical thinking, research, and empirical sciences, and this is right from inception. Islam began with a command to read or to recite, Iqra, and it also came with a unique supplication, Rabbi zidni ilma. So, and these are the characteristics of Islam. Islam is never anti-reason and anti-knowledge. My Lord, increase me with knowledge. While the Quran has roughly 350 verses on jurisprudence, which most of the Sharia scholars, base their jurisprudence, their legal rulings on this, there are twice as much, about 750 verses that are scientific in nature in the Quran. After the name of God, the word knowledge or ilm and its derivative, in a different position, whether it is in the noun position or adjective position or the verbal position, but this root of ilm is considered as the second most frequent word in the Quran. There are over 800 times this root that has been echoed. Now, you all know about, I don't need to quote all the, all these quotations from the Prophet regarding the importance of knowledge. So now we move to event that took place last year. There was a fire of this Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. On that fateful night, the world was gripped by images of cathedral in Paris, and it was engulfed in flames. It was unprecedented that a building on fire could spark such interest and mesmerize the global audience for days, especially, for a country that, really claimed to be secular. And this is a religious building. So emotion ran high when French President Emmanuel Macron addressed the French nation, and he said, all of us are burning in sympathy. So it's kind of interesting to find out, what does the building actually mean to French people, to French nation, to the Europeans, or even to the world. So France, we know it has long tradition of secularism, and the highest rates of atheism and agnosticism as well in Europe. But in response to the perceived threat of Islam, I think many people in France, they seem to start to revive their Christian national identity. And the Notre Dame Cathedral, being the symbol of Catholic faith at the heart of French capital, it probably explains that, why there was a euphoria of seeing such a great Christian monument is consumed by flames of fire. Now, people of France and Europe, they regard the Notre Dame Cathedral as symbol of a shared European cultural heritage. The Notre Dame Cathedral is also considered as the icon of Gothic architecture, and the tourists from all over the world, including myself, went to visit, this monument. So Notre Dame is in their priority program of sightseeing people who visit France. But what if this Gothic style that is so deeply associated with Catholicism in Europe was in fact inspired by Islamic architecture? There was an interesting article by Diana Dirk, a European scholar in Middle Eastern history. And in this article, he highlighted two important points. And she said the so-called European architectural heritage of Notre Dame is less European than people think. Few seem to know that the Parisian cathedral's architectural design owes a vast debt to the Islamic architectural heritage. To start with, this pointed arch is called Gothic arch, which is prevalent not only in the Notre Dame cathedral, but in all other great cathedrals of Europe, is actually an Islamic architectural design. And the first time it was seen in the 9th century Ibn Tulun Mosque in Cairo. And this was adopted. Not only it was adopted, but they also changed the name. They didn't leave it with the same name. They actually made it like their own. And this has become like a symbol of Gothic architecture. But Notre Dame Cathedral is not the only one that reflects on Islamic architectural heritage. There are many other cathedrals, churches, and public buildings in France and in Europe that have borrowed heavily features of Islamic architectural and structural design. So you have things related to domes, spires, or minarets. Arches, you have different types. Now, I just pointed out here a few, okay, like a pointed arch, multifoil arch, you can see the picture, ogee arch, intersecting trefoil arch, which is in the Notre Dame Cathedral, rose window, horseshoe arch, which is very common in North Africa and in Spain. Rose window, this idea of a circular window even the idea of having stained glasses, arch ceilings, and rib vault. These are techniques for to help structure heavy, to support heavy structure, you know, like ceiling, so that you can create indoor space. So many of these have been borrowed from the Muslim architecture. This picture is showing arch ceiling. This arch ceiling is a technique that allows actually to create this huge indoor space. Now, the picture in the middle is the Mosque of Cordoba. And this technique has been borrowed, and it has been used in these Christian cathedrals that you see on the left and on the right, exactly, you know, reflecting that. But the Cordoba Mosque, it was built in 786 in the 8th century, you know, more than 1200 years before any of these cathedrals that you see. Okay, so that's cover, you know, the area of the architecture, but we'll have a separate lecture just on architecture and on arts, or a separate inshallah episode. Now, the last part, you know, we're running out of time. We have 10 minutes, and I'll try to see how much I can cover. You all know what happened, you know, last month. President Emmanuel Macron, he gave a speech, and this speech was given in a city where, you know, the perpetrators of the, you know, the murder of Charlie Hebdo, they were undergoing their trial, and he made this statement in that speech. He said, Islam is a religion in crisis all over the world. And he unveiled a plan to confront and eradicate separatism and radicalism. And this includes the far-reaching reform of Islam in France to make it enlightened. So I want to respond to these two words: reform, reformation of Islam, or reforming Islam, and enlightenment, because these are, they're part of talking points of Islamophobes. They're part of talking points of, you know, the far-right politicians, secularists like Macron, and you know, there's a continuously attack, and they make a comparison with the Christian history of religion, because you know, Christianity went through Reformation, and you know, and therefore they think Islam also should be reformed. And he tried to explain the Enlightenment Islam as Islam that is compatible with European Enlightenment values, such that the faith structures itself to agree to these values and to the France secularism, or laïcité as they call it. Now, quickly, if you look at these two pictures, on the left, it shows the European experience. You know, they went through dark age, okay? So Europe lived in darkness and barbarism of the Middle Age under the grip of Roman Catholic Church for a millennia before that Reformation. So therefore, discussion of Reformation and Enlightenment in the context of European history with religion is relevant. But when Europe plunged into darkness and barbarism, the Muslim world was bright, and the Muslim cities were the most civilized cities in the world. This was the age of reason, culture, science, and innovation. So this represents our own enlightenment. So people were affluent, they enjoyed high standard of living and modern life. Therefore, a call for reforming Islam or an enlightenment Islam is grossly misguided. This is something that we should not accept. But even if we look at this European enlightenment, which is described as these Western values that were gifted to the world, things like human rights, democracy, gender equality, and others, you know, these things actually, when you think about them, you know, Muslim, they had that and they practice that, and they are very much, some of them, as a part of the Islamic teaching in the Quran and in the Hadith. For example, equality of women, equality of mankind, equality of gender equality, shura, you know, we have those. But, you know, my point is, enlightenment, the European enlightenment, it may have yielded positive benefits, you know, to Europeans and maybe to the world as well. But also, we should not forget that there are many disasters to mankind that have taken place under the Enlightenment watch. For example, the 19th century, it gave way to a pervasive agnosticism and atheism. The 20th century saw brutal colonialism, and France has dark, you know, history in this area. Then we saw communism, fascism, Nazism, two major world wars, use of chemical and nuclear weapons. We saw environmental disasters. And even in the 21st century, we're witnessing excessive militarism. We don't see excessive intellectualism, but we see a lot of militarism, destruction of many countries. We see Europe, rise of racism, intolerance. In France, we see intolerance of you know, basic practice, so basic religious practice. We see xenophobia, we see Islamophobia, we see white supremacy. So Muslim may have not trodden similar historical paths with religion as Europeans, but Islam is enlightened and reformed religion, because Islam, it came to correct some of at least the version Islam that came with the Prophet Muhammad SAW. It came to reform some of the things that were distorted by the previous nation, because the religion of God is one religion. It has always been Islam. So Prophet Muhammad SAW, he came to, as an, you know, to enlighten and to reform what was previously distorted. So Muslims, we never conceived of a conflict between faith and reason, never conceived a conflict between religion and science, or between religion and philosophy. And the Muslims, they deal better with others compared to secularism, because Islam teaches normative values. You know, when you deal with others, Islam teaches normative values of mutual understanding, of cooperation in good deeds, ta'awanu al-birri wa taqwa, competing in goodness, sabiqu fil khairat, support each other in faith and dignity, respect for what is sacred, and treat others with integrity and forgiveness. Which is more enlightened and which is more reformed? So just to complete, this is, I think, I have the last two slides. You'll bear with me maybe 5 minutes. We know that traditional French secularism was gentle and had no opinion on religious truth. It provided, supposed to provide the freedom of religion or belief for everyone, the neutrality of the state, and the respect for religious pluralism. But today, the gentle laicite has been replaced by very coercive secularism. That's what we see today. One of the unusual defining characteristics is the right to blasphemy, or the right to offend other sacred symbols under the pretext of freedom of speech. And it's overly obsessed with the slandering Prophet Muhammad SAW. It's amazing. The current discourse on Islam and Muslims in France and in other parts as well in Europe is gobbling between these four things. You know, they sometimes mix up between Islam as a faith and Muslim as followers. And that's why you find, you know, people like President Macron makes a very bold statement to generalize Islam in terms of, disregarding the 2 billion Muslims across the globe who practice this religion and, who find, who bank on their salvation on this religion. And they also mix up between ordinary, peaceful, practicing Muslims and radicals. Because, this idea of to fight separatism does not mean Muslims in France, they want to have their own country within France. No, separatism is this decency that is practiced in Islam where, Muslims, for example, a Muslim, when you visit a hospital, a Muslim man may require to be seen by a male doctor, or a female Muslim to be seen by a female Muslim doctor. These kind of things. Or to eat, when you go to supermarket, you need to be able to have the option of having halal food. So they see this as a separatism, meaning they really mix up between the basic religious observance and extremism, or the need to protect freedom of speech, as opposed to pressing people passionately to blasphemy or teaching innocent children to blasphemy. So that's conclude my talk today, but I want to leave you with this slide. This is my own reflection. I call this civilizational chariot, which is chariot is the cart that is used to kind of it is pulled by horses. Human progress never stops. It continuously unfolds in space and time like a racing chariot. So for Europeans to think that there was a civilization, the Greco-Roman, and then it stopped. They went into sleeping, and then one day they woke up and everything, crop up like a mushroom. That is really not true. It can borrow cultural knowledge from past civilizations, synthesize it and build on it by adding new values, produce new ideas and innovation, and pass on to the next. Like the way the Islamic, civilization and science, it was picked up by modern Europeans, and they added up new things. We recognize that. So the riders who ride the civilizational chariot will keep changing at different stations and epochs, different times. But the chariot must keep moving. In the classical period, the riders were the Greeks, and before that, they were Babylonians, Egyptians, Indians, Chinese. After the collapse of the classical Greeks, the Romans took over the control. When the chariot arrived in Arabia in the Middle Age, the riders changed to Muslims, and the chariot left South Spain, not Florence in Italy, as the Europeans try to claim, during the Renaissance, with modern Europeans as the new riders. And who knows who will be next. Shukran, jazakallah khair.